Alrighty, I think we're ready. All right, well, thank you for coming tonight. So, this Institute class is going to be a little different from the other ones. It's going to be not a lecture form, but very informal, just dialogue and discussion. And I'll invite my dad up here in a little bit, but let me just give a little bit of an introduction to this. So, thinking through pressing issues, one thought that I had was something that our culture has been talking about for quite some time and wrestling through, and that is the whole idea of socialism, the whole idea of communism, Marxism. How do we think through that? How do we understand that? And I found that even many in my generation and in millennials, Gen Zs, there were many people that started to think favorable towards that ideology and how it's kind of played out in the culture. And then I remember even back when Bernie came on the scene, Bernie Sanders, that's when that discussion really became public. And that really burdened me because anybody who knows history knows the absolute destructive nature of that ideology. And the comments that you hear of, well, we're talking about socialism, not communism, or, well, we're talking about democratic socialism. You know, that's what Bernie's really for. Well, none of that really matters because at the end of the day, once you boil it down, it all leads to one conclusion, and that's tyranny. It all leads to more and more power from the government over its people. So thinking through that, I thought it would be cool to invite my dad to talk about just life under Soviet Union, like what his experience was. So growing up in this environment of where it was a regime for the people, right? I mean, that's what we heard a lot. Well, socialism is all about the people. It's a people-focused regime. Well, how did the average man understand that? How did the average citizen understand that? And that's something that I thought would be cool for a discussion. So I'm gonna invite my dad up here. Sida. Тут microphone, yes. So it'll be kind of a back and forth dialogue and discussion. I'll be translating. And at first I thought maybe I would just give this because I am proudly born in '89, which is just 2 years before the fall of Soviet Union and Ukraine. So I am proudly claimed to be a Soviet, but I figured my 2 years is not enough of experience for you guys. So that's why I invited my dad here to talk about it. So the way we're gonna do it is we're just gonna break it down to 3 main categories that I thought. And that is just really kind of an informal discussion on everyday life, how it looked between individuals, the citizens, and the church and the government. So we're going to look at, I'm going to ask him some questions and then he'll talk about it. I'll translate just about personal life, what he experienced, and then life in the family, and then life in the church. We'll end on that. And then we'll leave time for questions for you guys to ask, and we'll you can pick up from our dialogue as you think of questions. Hopefully maybe you brought some of your own questions. But let me make 2 qualifications before we start. My dad and I were talking about this the other day, and we want to, in doing this, we're not trying to make a one-to-one comparison between Soviet communism and modern communism or socialism, if you want to call it. We understand that there is contextual differences between the two. The communism that was experienced, and some of this will come out too in our discussion. You'll see how it comes out. So don't take this as just kind of a one-to-one comparison of what my dad experienced, what he lived through is exactly what, we'll experience if the commies have their way in this country. Because it's a very different context, but the ideological principles behind that are very much so the same. And how they're going to play out in everyday life, there's going to be a lot of similarities there. And then the other thing I wanted to mention as a qualification is the persecuted church, because that's really what we're going to talk about. The persecuted church has and had flaws, both in their orthodoxy and in their orthopraxy. So both in their theology and then how they live that theology out. So in the presentation also, we have to learn to let history be history and let the people of God of that time be the people of God, and we learn and we grow and we move on, or we move forward by God's grace by learning from the past. So we'll go ahead and jump into it. We just had a list of questions that we came up with that I'll ask the question, and I'll have my dad talk, and I'll translate, and we'll just have kind of learn hopefully what it was like to live under this specific regime. То я задам вопроси, якщо ти будеш по-українськи говорити, тоді я буду переводити. Хорошо. Ну, ти по чуть-чуть тоді фрази говори, я буду переводити. So the first question will start with personal life. And one question I asked him was, how was personal property understood? So when we think about land, house, cars, just things that you own as an individual, how was that understood under this regime? Перший вопрос це...
Ну, що можна сказати? Колись одному пастору задали вопрос. Хіба в Совєтському Союзі нічого не було хорошого?
So once there was a pastor where they asked him a question, in a sense kind of a pushback, was there nothing good in the Soviet Union?
Він відповів, було, але мені нічого не доставалося.
So his answer was, there was plenty of good in the Soviet Union, I just saw none of it.
Ну, взагалі-то, Совєтський Союз, вона була, в принципі, вона була непогана страна по моралі, по відношенню до людей.
So generally speaking, if you think about just everyday life, Soviet Union was not a bad place to live in terms of just people, community, fellowship, and morals.
Ну, нам треба розділити те, що було, скажімо, до Другої світової війни і після.
One distinction we have to make when we think about Soviet Union is life before World War II and life after World War II.
Перед війною, десь до 20-х років, після революції десь до 20-х років, життя була, в принципі, така. Люди мали частну собственність, люди могли відкривати підприємства свої і могли якийсь забирати капітал. Була частна собственність.
Це до яких років було? So very early, up till about 1920, there was a sense of freedom in terms of personal property, in terms of people could work, people could earn a living for themselves, people could own certain property and assets in the early stages of leading up to the 1920s.
В 1924 году, коли помер Ленін, який був основатель Совєтського Союзу, почалися великі репресії. Прийшов Сталін до власті, і людей почали забирати собственність. Релігію об'явили, це вона вне закону.
So in 1924, Lenin died, and хто прийшов? And then that's when Stalin appeared and kind of took power, and that's when that regime really showed itself. So there was a lot of that's when personal property was taken. That's when religion started to be oppressed, and just people in general started to be oppressed.
І виходить, що десь до початку війни мільйони людей сиділи в тюрмах. Сиділи, були об'явлені врагами народу. І виходило так, що хто не нашої, скажімо, ти мені не понравився, я на тебе заявив, і тебе посадили.
And then from that time, leading to the beginning of World War II, there was millions of people that were in prison, and they were declared pretty much enemies of the state, because, and especially if you were a Christian, you were seen as somebody who opposed the state, opposed intellectualism, opposed any kind of progression in the culture.
Коли почалася війна, багато помінялася обстановка, тому що треба було захищати країну.
And then
В 41-му году.
And then naturally World War II changed that a little bit, because obviously there was a demand for soldiers and just defending your country, and so the focus kind of shifted from the leadership.
Після 45-го, десь 46-го року обстановка помінялася знову у хужу сторону до смерті Сталіна.
And then after the war, it started shifting back in the direction of oppression, and that, again, that regime kind of started to show itself.
Пізніше вже стало жити трошки краще людям. Я це говорю з історії, з того, що розказували старі люди. Мій батько розказував, як воно було життя тоді. Вже після війни вже почалося більш-менш трошки стало жити людям свободніше. Помер Сталін, прийшов до власті Хрущов, і диктатура власті, вона стала меншою.
So, I mean, he's looking at it from a more historical perspective, just from what he heard from his parents and those, because he didn't live through that portion of it. But he said when Stalin died, there was a short period of certain freedoms that did exist, where they kind of backed away a little bit from the oppression of the people.
Ми не говоримо зараз про церкву ми будемо говорити пізніше. А взагалі життя, воно стало краще і краще з кожним роком. Машину, скажімо, люди не мали такої великої частної собственності, як, скажімо, в других странах.
So we're kind of not talking about the church specifically right now, but just general life in Soviet Union. And then he mentions things like a car, the freedom to just go and own certain aspects like a car just didn't really exist in the way that maybe certain European countries or America had.
В лучшому случаї в мене міг бути велосипед.
He said in the best case he had a bicycle.
Вже сюди ближче до 60-х років люди могли мати машини. Як простоїш в очереді 10-12 років.
And then if you could sign up to buy a car, but sometimes you had to wait 10 to 12 years in line before you could even get a car.
Взагалі-то, вже за моєї пам'яті, Совєтський Союз, вона була непогана страна, була безплатна медицина, безплатна учоба була. Сім'я вважалася чоловік, жінка і, в кращому випадку, 2 дітей.
So there were certain benefits just from the aspect that you gained. The government would provide free things like medicine and things like that. And then he talked about family life. So family life was valued in the Soviet Union, and which this is something that in talking to him, I was kind of, I didn't fully know the morals, because you had, I remember we were talking at home about this, but you had a regime that was very anti-God, but that regime valued family morality, which was very interesting. And he just said that it was very common, you get married, you have two, 3 kids, and that was valued in many ways, which is a stark difference from thinking through modern socialism, modern communism, modern Marxism, which is anti-God, but also along with it is very anti-moral, just pushes all morality out. Ми можемо на другий вопрос, якщо хочете, чи ти про сім'ю? Про сім'ю. One question I had, I asked him just even the availability of goods. This was we talked about this a while back, but про джинси, можеш сказати, коли,
В магазинах були товари, це всі товари були одного фасона. Якщо люди ходили, це були однакові костюми, однакові ботинки, все. Скажімо, такого одежу, як джинси, щось таке модерне, лучше, його в магазинах не було. Продавали його подпольно і робили подпольно.
So the government controlled your life down to the point of what you could buy, how you dressed. So if you go to the marketplace and you wanted to buy clothes, it was clothes that was sponsored and produced and manufactured by the government. Who were the designers that designed that clothes? The government. So if you wanted to go and buy something that was a little more modern, let's say jeans, you couldn't buy it. You had to literally go outside the country and get it from different places. So they were, and there was also a sense of uniformity. So everybody pretty much looked the same. How they wanted, because that's how the government wanted you to dress. So you would go to the same place, you would buy the same clothes, and that's in many ways how everybody looked.
Були подпольні фактори, де делали джинси. Самі люди делали цей дизайн, все, шили. Якщо їх знаходили, їх сажали в тюрму, штрафували, конфісковували імущество, оце все.
So there were certain factories where people, kind of underground factories, where people would make clothes that didn't fit the regime's design, like jeans, for example. And the government, if they were to find them, they would arrest them, and they were thrown in prison. So these individuals that kind of, strayed from the regime, they would control down even and arrest people and throw them in prison down to the point of even you're making clothes that we do not approve.
Для членів правительства були віддільно, їх свої були магазини, де вони скуплювали свої продукти, там були одежа, там все було для їх віддільно.
So he said that the government and the leaders and the officials had their own stores. So they had their own produce that they would go and buy, their own clothes. There were pretty much separate stores that were only for, we use the term today, the elites of the society, where the regular citizen couldn't go. Можна про церкву.
Ну, це було це обще обозріння, скажімо так, ну, Совєтського Союзу, як тоді було там. Отношення церкви і держави, вони були, ну, це були дві противоборствуючі сторони.
Я не поняв.
Це були дві враждебні сторони.
So moving on now to the church, how kind of the relationship between the church and state was viewed. They were viewed as from the unchristian world in the Soviet Union and the government themselves. They were viewed as completely two separate entities.
І ну, тут теж можна поділити на два періоди, навіть на три. Один період був до смерті Леніна, від революції до смерті Леніна. Там було нормально.
So he said that this also historically you can kind of split up into three different time periods where pre-World War II, leading up to the death of Lenin, there was a sense of religious freedom that existed.
До 20-х років була свобода релігіозна. Було два союзи, ну, крім православних, ми не беремо православних, то були православні, ортодокс. А із протестантів були два союзи – Баптисти і Євангельський союз.
So, we're talking specifically Protestant Christianity, not leaving Orthodox aside. That was kind of its own journey and how that worked itself out. But up until the 1920s, there were two main kind of Baptist associations that existed, and again, it had a sense of religious freedom that was present then.
Були курси, були школи проповідників, були музикальні курси, випускали журнал, печатали Біблії. Ну, це все було до того моменту, коли помер Ленін. Чого була така свобода? Тому що до революції Ленін сидів в тюрмі із баптистами, з багатьма.
So he's just emphasizing the freedom that did exist. There was literature that could be published, Bibles that could be translated, and just general freedom that existed for the Christians. And a lot of it had to do because Lenin, before the revolution, he was actually imprisoned with certain Christians at that time. So there was, I guess, just a sense of what's the word? I guess he kind of felt bad for them, and then, you know, gave them freedom.
В 20-х роках були закриті ці союзи повністю. Був організований союз безбожників. І пішло велике протистояння церкви, і церква йшла в підполье.
І це государство організувало? Так, це було, як це государство? In the 1920s, then after his death, the government pretty much shut down Christianity in a sense. So they shut down Protestant, these associations. They formed their own Christian association, and that what was considered kind of the allowed church, the allowed Christianity that could exist.
І церква була, вони позакривали всі церкви по Союзі, оставили 2-3 церкви, скажімо, в Москві і в Ленінграді, ну, Санкт-Петербург зараз, для того, щоб коли приїжджали іностранці, вони приводили і показували, що в нас же релігіозна свобода.
So they pretty much shut down all the churches across Soviet Union except for a few that they left in the big, well-known cities like Moscow and now St. Petersburg. And the main reason for that was when people from other countries that would come, they would take them to these cities and would show them these churches so that they could show to them that we have religious freedom. You know, you see these churches. And it was interesting, we talked about this earlier, but under Soviet Union constitution, they believed in religious freedom, which is pretty interesting when you see what's going on in our country, where our Constitution very clearly believes in religious freedom, but when you give more and more control to individuals that don't actually care about that, we're living through examples of how it doesn't matter whether what the Constitution says. And that's in many ways what Soviet Union had also, because on paper they had religious freedom, but in reality it didn't exist. There was no religious freedom at all.
Люди, всі, хто хотів жити по християнських законах, вони дуже багатьох посадили в тюрми, забирали дітей у їх. Церкви були закриті, собиралися подпольно групками невеликими.
Christians that lived out their Christianity were arrested, families were separated, kids were taken from them, and Christianity pretty much kind of spread in many ways to kind of an underground church where it was home-based churches. Just persecution set in.
Бували такі случаї, якщо молоді люди хочуть женитися, організувати сім'ю, і вони хочуть, щоб над ними хтось помолився, бувало до того, що не могли знайти, хто міг над ними молитись. Боялися пастора, як такі сиділи по тюрмах, а прості брати боялися молитися.
So there were examples, if young people wanted to get married and they wanted somebody to pray over and bless their marriage, even privately, not just publicly, but privately, if the state found out that they had somebody pray over them, they would be arrested. They wouldn't even necessarily go after the person, if they knew obviously who prayed over them, but even just the young people would be arrested and put in prison just because they sought a blessing over their marriage.
Арестовували того, хто молився над ними, і молодих, і чоловіка, і жінку. І бували случаї, що давали 10 років без права переписки. Це значить, що його чи її, скажімо, йому дали 10 років без права переписки, її 25 років. Його це значить, що його розстріляли.
And they would go after the individual who prayed over them, and they would go after the young people that were getting married, and there were times where they were thrown in prison for up to 10 or 25 years and even executed. The man would be executed over that.
Так було до 44-го року, коли під давленням Америки і Англії Совєтський Союз должен був відкрити церкви, дати свободу, тому що було условие, що ми відкриваємо другий фронт, якщо ви даєте релігіозну свободу в Союзі.
So that persecution existed up to kind of more towards the end of World War II, and that's mainly because of the pressure that outside countries would place on them, where they demanded a certain freedom, religious freedom from the government. There were two journal articles that we found that I wanted to show you guys that kind of demonstrated how the culture would view Christians, how they viewed Christianity. And you can see, so obviously you can't read it. Ну да. So this was later. He's saying these would be like in the 60s, which, but on the left there, it's talking about how living dead. So this is an article that was published in the newspaper, citizens would view Christians, and in many ways how the government wanted people to view Christians was they're the walking dead. So they're dead to the culture, to society, but they're alive. And then on the right side, it's talking about and then it talks about how Christians were ones who didn't want any progress. They were stuck in some dead form of humanity and intellectualism, and they didn't want to progress in any way. And the Soviet Union, obviously, the communism and Marxism was the progression. That was the only way that they would tell people that this is the only progression. And Christians don't have any intellectualism, they don't have any reason to them or anything like that.
Все. Після смерті Сталіна вже став этим генеральним секретарем, став Хрущов. Політика насчет церкви не помінялася. Задача була така: в 80-му году показати останнього віруючого по телевізору.
So then after the death of Stalin, kind of moving forward historically, there's not much changed in terms of how the government viewed Christians. And they had this agenda. They had this agenda pretty much to just wipe out Christianity because they clearly viewed Christianity as a threat. So the way that they talked about it was, we're going to show on the TV the last Christian because we wiped them out. They don't exist anymore.
Задача була зробити страну, безбожну страну. Ми можемо без Бога. Бог нам не нужен.
So their goal was to make a godless society, and that is what led, obviously, to this view of Christianity and the destruction of Christians.
Церкви закривали. Ті, що церкви, що пооткривали во время війни, їх почали закривати, укрупняли. Брали 2-3 церкви, соєдиняли в одну. Дітей в церкву не пускали. Діакони стояли на дверях і дітей в церкву не пускали.
So they would go through and close churches down, and one thing that was really interesting is they didn't allow children into the church. So the registered church, so the church that kind of, followed to some degree the government, they actually had deacons that would stand at the door and wouldn't allow children to come in because the state forbid it. And it's just interesting when we were talking about this earlier, how relevant that is for what we see today, and just how there's always a battle for the heart of children, for the hearts and minds of kids. And you have a regime like under the Soviet Union that clearly saw that, and they understood that if we let the kids in, they're gonna hear this propaganda as they saw it.
Якщо молоді люди хотіли прийняти хрещення, вони повинні були написати заяву, заповнити анкету, яка передавалася в гавермент. Гавермент запрещав хрестити спочатку до 18 років, потім до 35.
So if you wanted to get baptized, you had to file kind of a formal petition with the government, and the government would actually give you permission to get baptized. And for a certain time, they didn't allow anyone under 18 to get baptized. не розрішали до 18, а тоді розрішали.
Після 18, а потім зробили закон. Після 35.
Ну, розрішали. Да, а тоді 35. Yeah, and then later they changed they changed that law to you couldn't get baptized until 35. So only those who were 35 and older were allowed to be baptized.
І багато потім далі було ще запрещали в церквах музику, хори. Гості не мали проповідувати ніхто. Должны були проповідувати тільки зареєстровані в гавременті проповідники.
The other thing is they controlled the music in the church. So they didn't allow choirs and certain, pretty much they controlled how worship was done. And only registered preachers with the state could preach in the church. So you couldn't just have anybody come up and preach.
Збори, які збирали, пожертвування, десятина, оці всі, як обичні збори, вони повинні були хранитися у Государственному банку. Якщо схотіли, гавермент міг їх забрати.
Church money and offering was held in the government bank. It was mandated that it would be held in the government bank, and obviously the government could seize that anytime they wanted to.
Іде собрання, якщо прийшли із правительства чи там з КГБ, побачили дітей, просвітеру буде мінімум 100 рублів штрафу.
If the KGB would show up at a church service and they would see kids during the service, they would automatically fine the pastor of that church.
І виходить, що багато людей, які переживали за дітей, вони перестали ходити в такі церкви.
Which that led naturally to people kind of leaving the church because they didn't, people that cared for the kids, they didn't want to be part of that system.
У нас у цьому поселку, откуда я родом, був случай. Приїхав старший просвітер з вищого і почав розказувати за те, що якщо ви будете пускати дітей в церкву, вас заберуть молитвенний дом. Ви ж не хочете залишитися без молитвенного дому?
So where the town that he grew up in, there was an example of where somebody kind of from the denomination would show up and started talking to the leadership of the church where they grew up, and pretty much started telling them that they shouldn't let kids in because if you keep letting kids in, they're going to take your church building, and obviously you don't want to lose your church building, right? So you had in the registered church, you had this pressure that would come from pastors and leaders that just gave in to the government.
І один із братів, він був діакон, якого було, по-моєму, 10 дітей, чи не пам'ятаю. Він задає вопрос, а як же ж ми ж йдемо в Царство Небесне, а як же ж діти, ну це ж якось нехорошо. Він відповідає, ви подивіться на цього відсталого чоловіка, ми йдемо в комунізм. Комунізму віруючих не буде, а він переживає за дітей.
And one of the individuals at that church asked that pastor a question and said, well, but we're going into the kingdom of God, and how can we leave our kids behind? Shouldn't our kids be with us? And that leader, pastor, responded that, well, but we're heading into communism, and communism's not going to have any Christianity. So you don't want to be like this man who asked the question, who's going to get left behind.
І так було, такий контроль, тотальний контроль церкви був до 61-го року. Він був і далі, але над тими церквами, які були реєстровані в гавременті.
And that control was really seen leading up to 61, and then even after that, that control continued, but it just took on a different form.
У 61-му году була організована, вона називалась ініціативна група, для того, щоб вирішувати ці всі питання, щоб зібрати з'їзд баптистів і все це обговорити, щоб уйти з-під контролю государства.
And during that time, there was Christians that gathered to talk about how do we leave this government? How do we not leave the government, but how do we separate the church from this regime and this oppression that's coming upon the church, and not just give in the way that the registered church was giving in.
З'їзд не розрішили, і частина церков йшла знову в підполье.
That meeting never took place because the government obviously didn't let it take place, and that's what led to a lot of the churches separating out, and kind of you had the underground church that was being formed.
Багато церков почали збиратися по домам, скажімо, невеликі групи. В нас у Києві була дуже велика церква, була десь до 400 чоловік. Почали збиратися в лісі, вона називалась Лісна церква.
Many of those churches would meet at home, and you had house churches that were formed, and then the larger churches. So the church that he attended had around 400 people. They would go and meet. They would meet in the forest. So pretty much they was just called the forest church, and there's some pictures. I'll kind of just scroll through them as we're talking. But you can see the size and the amount of people where they would individuals would gather in secluded places and would just have worship in the forests.
Присутствували діти, музика була, хори. І багато ж зимою переходили в дома до віруючих, в дома, в апартменти. Коли назначали собрання, от, скажімо, у кого-то дома, повністю з дому виносилася мебель. 200-300 чоловік було в хаті, собиралися.
And they would meet with everybody. All families were present, kids would come. A lot of times, wintertime, they would find certain homes to meet in, and they would just bring out all furniture from homes and would just pack the house fully tight as much as they can. But also, it was interesting, too, that there's some of the pictures that you see how as the church, as they met, they weren't necessarily trying even to hide. They would have choirs, they would have bands that would play. I mean, you saw from some of those pictures, they would take the time to put up placards, you know, of Bible verses and things like that. So in many ways, this was a very bold move for the church, because what they were doing obviously was completely against the regime.
Багато руководящих братів, пресвітерів, пасторів давали спочатку по 3 роки, потім давали 3 роки відсидів, автоматично додають ще 6. Багато бувало давали 5 років і 5 років ссилки.
And then this led to continued persecution, because the government would come in and they would go after these churches. They would go after the Christians that would meet, and their goal was to arrest the leaders of the church. So they would try to get the pastors, the preachers, and arrest them. And they were given 5 years. Some were given 10 years, and the sentence would just keep getting added on. Their goal was to arrest the people and not let them out.
сажали не за те, що віруючий християнин, а підтасовували статті. Вовлечення там молодих в релігію. Прийшов з тюрми, не давали достроїтися на роботу, місяць не поработав, сажали типу, за те, що безробітний, що не працюєш ніде.
And then there was also just a form of societal persecution that took place where even after you left prison, you weren't allowed to work. You were limited on what you can do, where you could work, and so there was a sense of cultural and societal persecution that would take place.
Ну, тим не менше, не дивлячись ні на що, церква росла. Дуже багато церков було, зробили своє іздательство. Біблії ніхто не печатав в цьому Союзі. Закази були Біблії від ортодокс церкви. Біблію достати було дуже важко. Взагалі християнської літератури її ніде не було, так, в продажі чи що, її не було.
There was pretty much almost no literature, Christian literature that was published. Bibles were requested and received kind of from the Orthodox Church. The government limited on what you could print, and so you didn't have any kind of theological and literature, even Bibles in general, that were produced.
Завозили підпольно із-за границі. З Фінляндії завозили з Польщі, з Германії через Польщу. Якщо знаходили хто їх віз, скажімо, іностранні туристи, вони їх депортували, вони не могли вже більш приїхати, скажімо, 10-12 років у Совєтський Союз.
Bibles and literature, Christian literature, theological literature was brought in from other countries, from Europe and the surrounding countries. But obviously, if you were caught, then there would be heavy persecution, prison, and and then sometimes they would even just move people outside the country. They would just confiscate everything they had and just would physically remove them from the country.
Почали думати, брати, і організували, воно називалося «Іздательство християнин». Начали печатати Біблії, начали печатати пісенні зборники, детську літературу.
It was about that time that there were a group of Christians that started an underground kind of printing ministry where they started printing Bibles and children's literature and literature for Sunday school curriculum and for kids.
Це все були підпольні точки. Делали печатний станок, зробили його в Києві перший. Тут в Києві, в цій церкві, де ми вже були членами. Перший цей станок, зробили його в Києві. І печатали, підпольно печатали.
One of the first printing presses that the Christians built back then was in Kiev, the church that he attended. They built it. There were a certain group of brothers that built it from that church.
Бумаги не можна було достати. Купляли по 2-3 пачки в магазинах простих. Обичну бумагу A4, от этот формат. Якщо ти купляв 10 пачок, продавець міг позвонити в міліцію, в поліцію. Спросити, а для чого ти ці бумаги печатав?
It was very hard to get paper, so they would go and buy paper, but you had to watch what you could buy, the amount that you can buy, the quantity. So if you bought more than a certain amount, that would get reported to the government, and the government would investigate that.
Багато точок поарештовували, понаходили. Здавали сусіди, були люди, які здавали, працювали на government, і багато людей сиділо в тюрмах за печатання.
Which that obviously led to huge persecution based on that, on many people who were producing the literature, printing the literature were arrested. There was, whether from neighbors or whatever, individuals that found out, people were thrown in prison who would participate in this ministry.
діти віруючих не могли йти вчитися далі. Закінчували high school, і все, далі вони могли йти в цю, типу, протитехнічну школу. Туди, скажімо, університет, і все для віруючих було закрито.
One aspect of just societal and cultural persecution was older kids who were from Christian families were not allowed to pursue higher education. So after they were done with regular school, you were very limited on what your options were if you wanted to pursue any form of higher education. You weren't allowed to go to university. You weren't allowed to go to colleges. Pretty much your option were like very basic, maybe tech schools, and that's it.
Не розрішали ні private школи, ні домашні. Все було тільки государственне обучення.
So I asked him about like private school, homeschooling. So obviously none of that was allowed. So you were not allowed to have any kind of private school. You weren't allowed to homeschool at all. The only education, primary education that existed was the state school, and that's where you were mandated to send your kids.
Якщо я працюю на роботі і знаю, що я віруючий, кар'єру зробити я вже не можу. Мені будуть, якщо я, скажімо, водитель, це мені машина, нас говорили, з-під забора, яка поломана, я її должен відремонтувати, і потім працюю на її. Нову машину ніколи не давали. Так точно було і в других відношеннях, там, де багато працювали на фермах. Отношення до віруючих було негативне.
Christians also were heavily persecuted in the workforce, so they weren't really, they couldn't progress at all. They were very limited on how far they could get. They had to deal with whatever scrap was given to them. So there was no sense of you would get the worst car if you were a driver. If that car broke down, you would have to fix it. You weren't given a better car. Pretty much you were just considered the bottom, and everything that could be that was the worst was handed to you.
Коли Україна вже відділилася від Совєтського Союзу, це була одна з самих прогресивних стран по релігіозній свободі.
So you said when Ukraine left Soviet Union, when the split happened, it was one of the most freest countries when it comes to religious freedom from the old Soviet Union countries.
І одне з моїх понімань, чого війна на сьогоднішній день між Росією і Україною, це одна з причин того, що такої релігіозної свободи, як в Україні, що це війна іменно проти релігіозної свободи, яку дала людям Україна.
And in his opinion, kind of the modern war that's taking place has a lot to do with this pushback against the religious freedom and the freedom that was seen in Ukraine from Russia.
Ну і читує мій опит того, що ми жили в Совєтському Союзі, такого соціалізму, скажімо так, я не хочу. Це була одна з причин, чого ми уїжджали оттуда 25 років назад. Ну і що зараз тут ми живемо.
In terms of just kind of, we're going to bring this to a conclusion, but in terms of the type of socialism and communism that he lived through, he would never want to live through it again. It's not something, and that was one of the reasons that we as a family left left that country. And it was interesting earlier when we were talking, my dad made this interesting comment of how Soviet Union was, kind of half jokingly, but Soviet Union was great. I just would not want to live there again. And in many ways, that's kind of what, almost kind of summarize it, where it's like, yeah, it was great. You got a bunch of free stuff, but I would never want to live there. Последнее хочешь что сказать на вопросы? All right, well, we'll conclude it there. Again, we just wanted to kind of get a general feel for a life under a regime, and this sense of this form of ideological socialism and communism that existed. So we'll open up for questions, and we'll finish it up there. Насчет народа, скільки народа хотіли жити, не хотіли жити, кому нравилось, кому не нравилось, скажімо, там, половину не нравилось. Ні, тоді коли.
Багато людей хотіли уїхати. Не нравилось. Багатьом людям не нравилось. Нравилось тим, хто був при руководстві. Прості люди, які просто жили так, тому що другого виходу не було. Страна була повністю бордер закритий.
Many people wanted to leave, and he said pretty much what it boils down to is your average man, your average citizen did not want to live there, but they could not leave. And the individuals who wanted to live there were usually the ones who had some form of higher standing in the government or just culture in general. Большинство людей тоді понімали, що це типа якби неправильна ідеологія чи жизнь, чи
Вони нічого не могли. Вислухали, що цікаво. Устраювалися на кораблі. Пливли, корабель пливе, там десь возле Канади. Випригували і плав до Канади. Старалися втікти в машинах, вивезти. Хто як міг, так і хто кому геть було не в моготу, старалися виїжджати. Коли хто виступав проти, їх сажали в тюрму.
Yeah, majority of the people, he said, did understand that this is a failing system and they did not want to live there. And there were plenty of examples of people that tried to escape and just any way possible, getting on boats, going to Canada, and whatever options existed. There were examples of people escaping, and if the government caught them escaping, they were imprisoned.
Багато було, що виступали проти цього. Скажімо, такий був академік Сахаров. Він придумав, він виступав за це, він був невиїзний. Його в тюрму не посадили, тому що не могли, бо він був в зоні. А за границю виїхати він не міг.
There were also certain people who were kind of intellectuals and higher individuals in the culture that spoke out against this. He talks about an individual who actually was one of the ones who was part of the scientific team that created the atomic bomb. He spoke out against it, and they actually didn't imprison him because of just kind of his well-known influence and status, but he was not allowed to leave the country, and he was very limited on what he could do in his speaking out against it. насчет моральності, він питає, що була, як вони дивились на сім'ю, було дуже позитивне, но вони хотіли, щоб це була позитивна сім'я і моральність, но як насчет дітей, вони дивилися, що це їхні діти?
Насчет моралі не дивились нормально. Якщо ти віруючий, ти не мав права воспитувати дітей. Троє дітей, вони до многодітних було отношення трохи таке не дуже. А взагалі вони дивились на дітей як собственне государство. Приходило мені 18 років, і мене забирали в армію. Це було обов'язково.
Yeah, so in many ways, absolutely. Even though they did have a somewhat high morality when it comes to family, they absolutely viewed the family and children as their property. And hence, military was mandated, so you turned 18, you have to go to the military. If you were a Christian family, you were not allowed to raise your kids in a Christian way, just officially speaking. Obviously, Christians did, but officially speaking, in terms of how the state viewed it, yeah, absolutely, they viewed the children as their property in the family.
В церквах були, в таких церквах, які були, скажімо, не під реєстрацією гавермента, там були дитячі школи. Вони були підпольні, і багато молодих сестер, і, так як тут з дітьми це займаються. І багато молодих сестер посадили в тюрми за те, що вони займалися з дітьми. Християнські сім'ї старалися дітей вчити в християнському дусі. Ну, це було підпольно, про це було, ніхто нічого, старалися, щоб це було скрито.
So there were underground schools that were formed. So the underground church would form certain schools, and that because they saw the value in educating their kids from a Christian perspective. Christian families were invested heavily in their kids, the parents, in raising them from a Christian perspective. But many of the women, especially that were part of these schools, got arrested and were imprisoned. Go ahead. Були коли що діти проти родителей в школі, що вони ходили,
Були, що діти не хотіли ходити. Ідеологія так обрабатувала дітей деяких, що вони уходили вже вплоть до того, що відказувалися.
Yeah, he said there were examples of where kids, because they were under this ideological education system, there were examples of where they would rebel against their parents and even leave the home and even just renounce their family.
В наше время вже не так було, там вже не заставляли відказуватися. А скажімо, 30-ті года, 30-ті, 40-ті, 50-ті года, коли при Сталіні було, так там вплоть до того, що відкажися від своїх батьків, і тебе зразу піде продвиження по кар'єрі, лестниці, по всьому. Ти підеш вчитися, і все далі.
So during his time, he said the persecution on that front wasn't as big. They even though kids that would leave their home, the government didn't necessarily mandate them to kind of renounce their family, but in the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s, the government pretty much mandated that you would renounce your parents, renounce your family, and the threat that was given or the encouragement was your status in society is automatically going to be increased if you do that. Go ahead. When did he leave? Oh. Вона питає, коли ти уїхав. Ну це вже So we left in '98, but this is after, you know, all of kind of the fall of the Soviet. So in '98 there was that persecution wasn't there on that level at all. So yeah. So it wasn't like we fled necessarily, you know, during Soviet Union or. And he said Ukraine was very different also because it almost right away had a sense of religious freedom that was very clearly seen and kind of promoted. So he said it multi-generational. So from his dad's side, he can remember back to 3 generations that were Christian, and then from his mom's side, it's even further than that. Yeah. So his his grandfather was a Christian. He was in prison and persecuted yeah, for 10 years. He said he was persecuted or imprisoned. Which then got changed to 5 years, and then for a year he couldn't leave because something that they did is they would take a lot of these prisoners to Siberia. So they would remove them from their home, take them to Siberia, and what happened was they were in 5 years. After 5 years, they were released, but they wouldn't give them any paperwork, so they couldn't leave. They couldn't go home. They couldn't travel. So they were pretty much just. So technically, the persecution continued. It was just a very different form of it. Прожив те, що ти прожив, ти бачиш щось, це, що ми ще живемо в Америці, це, що ще случається, ти бачиш similarities, що є, і що б ти сказав би, ну, скажімо, Америці або сьогоднішнє времені прожив оце. So he said it's hard for him to compare because the Soviet Union had a very clear agenda to wipe out the church, where today, living through this, our current culture, our current society, it's a different context where they're not necessarily trying to wipe out the church. So he just said it's hard to kind of compare for him.
І той соціалізм, який був у Союзі, трохи відрізняється від цього соціалізму, що
Як він відрізняється? По твоєму. So he's saying that it's hard to make that comparison because the socialism that existed back then had certain differences where there was kind of a total control that existed, where today you have a socialism that's trying to break in, but you still have kind of this leftover understanding of personal property, even things like owning guns and things that back then was just completely not allowed, not seen at all. А якщо буде, що б ти сказав би? Як ти прожив оце? So, so he's saying that another difference, obviously, is the control that the government is having on churches is there but limited compared to what it was. But I asked him if it were to get extreme, what would kind of be his advice, and he said the biggest aspect of this is training up your kids, focusing on family, applying scripture, and raising a godly generation. Go ahead, Ian. Як государство йшло проти цих церквей, які не реєстрували? Були моменти, що вони представляли себе як брати, як християни, щоб піти в ці церкви?
Коли церква зареєстрована, просто приходили на собрання, просто сиділи, слухали, записували, хто участвував, як, що, і потім, согласно того, виписували штрафи. Вже, скажімо, після 75-го року, то такого прямого розгону, скажімо, немає. Випустя було, валяли в різних домах, забирали ті, бувало, що розвалювали. А у нас, в принципі,
So that persecution took on various kinds of forms. So there were examples of where certain KGB agents or government officials would kind of fake their way into the church. But more so, he said it was kind of they would just physically come and shut the service down. They would remove the Christians, arrest people, and then later 70s into 80s, what that persecution was more of kind of control, where they wouldn't necessarily disperse the church, but they would come to the church service, they would sit in, they would take records of who's preaching, who's talking, and they would just have a record of everything that's taken place. But and then that's in Kiev, where he grew up. But in other towns, he said there were many examples of where they would come in and break up the church, take the people out, and actually just demolish the church buildings. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I actually had that same question when we were looking at these pictures. Ну, вона питає, що це не ті що не сильно ховаються, а просто.
Це за пределами города. Можеш там показати, як їхали собрати. Туди їхали, на собрання їхали по частям. По 3-4 чоловіка, так ясно, іде в ліс, а обратно вже їхали.
Yeah, so he said, because I had the same question. We were looking at this, prepping for the lesson, and he said that so there it was kind of a secret meeting from the perspective of you were trying to the leadership of the church would actually go out and pick certain places on where they would meet in forests. So it was very secluded areas, and it was passed down then kind of in a secret way where people would come. They wouldn't just pack up and everybody not drive, but everybody would come in the exact same location. So everybody would try to come from different areas, and families would kind of, you'd have one family that would go, wait 10 minutes, another family that would go. But when they gathered, it was very much so a corporate celebration. And they worshipped, and there were times when the authorities would come and then start shutting down the service. But what's interesting is after the service, everybody would just walk out of the forest together. So, which, it's just, I guess at that point, it didn't really matter, because what are you going to do? The service was done at that point. And they met in all kinds of different locations. So. Any other questions? Alrighty, well, let me close us out with prayer, and thank you guys for coming. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time. Thank you that we could look at the history of your people, the recent history. We can look at just the different